Our next topic in this chapter is default constraint. In our previous example, we didn't provide urgency ID and the row was added with a null value. This one. What if we don't want a null value for the missing urgency ID and want to see a value? To achieve that, we need to provide a default value with the help of default constraint. Let's add default constraint to dim patient first. So we simply need to alter the dim patient table again. And then we say add constraint, and this is default constraint, so we give this name df underscore dim patient underscore urgency ID, so that's a meaningful name. And then we need to provide the default value, default default, and that value will be 0 for urgency ID. Right. So what are we doing here is we are altering the dim patient table and we are adding a default constraint to dim patient table. Correct that one, dim patient table, and that will be on urgency ID, and the default value will be 0 for urgency ID. So run this one. Command completed successfully. If we refresh it and see our table, that's our dim patient table, and that's our constraints. So this is our constraint, default constraint, dim patient urgency ID. That's the one we just created, showing here. Right, so that's done. One more time to add a row without the urgency ID. Right, okay. So just copy this code again. There. And then this time we give this number 110, and entry we just change the name to entry. It was null before, let's call it default. Age, let's say 0, and then we are not providing the urgency ID again. And if we run this time, so the row is inserted. If we run the dim patient table and see what happens. Right, so that's the row we added. 110 patient ID, that's the one with the entry default. Age is 0, city is York, and we did not provide any urgency ID on this occasion, but because we have added default constraint as 0, so it added 0 there. Let's do one more test. Add a record with urgency ID equal to null. What do you think will happen? Do you think the urgency ID will be null as we are providing a null value, or the null will be replaced by the default constraint? Let's do that again. Just copy this code, add it here. This occasion change the number, put a different number, any random 151, let's see, and then change this one. Let's call it null, not default. So we will be adding null, that's why we are calling it entry null, not default. Leave the age 0, city name 0, and then we need to add null there and end. But before that, if you remember, when we were trying to run our query in the past, it failed because it said the number of columns does not match with the number of values. So we have patient ID, name, age, and city, 1, 2, 3, 4. But for values, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So the column which is missing is urgency ID. Because we are providing urgency ID, we need to add to our list of columns. So if we run this now, command completed successful, and if we select the data, last column, last row is 151, that's patient ID, entry null, not default, that's there, age is 0, city is York, and as you can see, because we provided the default, we provided the urgency ID null, so it has added null there. So the point to note here is default value constraint will only kick in when value is missing for that field. But if we provide a value, even if it is null, it will override the default value or default constraint, and it will add to the table. Right, so we learn to add a default constraint and insert the data to the table for it to work. What if you want to add a new column to your table that acts as a default value constraint? We can do that by same syntax. What we need to do is we need to alter table. In fact, we can just copy our previously altered table code from there. That's our alter table, and we are going to add a new column. Add, that's our column name, constraint ID, and data type is going to be integer, and that will be our constraint. Give it a meaningful name, df underscore name of the table, dim patient, then name of the column, constraint ID, and it is going to be default, so we need to add the word default, and we need to provide a value in brackets. So let's just pick any random number. We give it number 10, and then if we run this, so it's done. We have successfully added a new column to our dim patient table, and that will act as a default constraint, and the value will be number 10. If we run our table and see, that's our newly created column. If we refresh our database, go to our tables, that's dim patient table, expand it. This is our new column. If we go to constraints, and this is our second constraint. First one was urgency ID, and second is constraint ID, default. Right. In case you don't need this default constraint anymore and you want to drop this constraint, you can do so. Very simple. Just alter the table again. Alter the table, and now just copy the name of the constraint, which is this one. Put it there. And because we added the constraint ID before, this time we are going to drop constraint df underscore dim patient underscore constraint ID. And if we execute this, and let's see, constraint ID is still there as a column, but the default constraint will be dropped. So let's refresh our database, go to tables, dim patient, look at the columns here, that's there, constraint ID as a column is there, but under constraints, before there were two default constraints, one was urgency ID and second one was constraint ID, but we just managed to delete our constraint ID, which has just disappeared from that. So this is how you can add and delete a default constraint.